I'm Richard Barrett, and today I'm going to be talking about the 7 stages of psychological development. One of the questions that people often ask me is, why is it important to reassess your values at different stages in our lives? That's the first question I'm going to answer today, and you may have had that question as you've been looking through the e-learning course. So we grow in stages of development. There are 7 stages. The first stage is really about learning how to survive, and that occurs between 0 and, well, actually from the moment of conception in the womb through to about 2 years of age, when the reptilian mind brain is active and the main brain that you're using during that period. And then after about 2 or 3, the limbic mind brain becomes more dominant, and then around the age of 8 or 9, the neocortex begins to, it's already developing in the background, but it becomes much more important. And that's the rational part of our brain. The brain doesn't stop growing and developing until we reach the age of around 20 or 21 or 22. Are all about learning to be in whatever world you're in. You will learn how to fit to that world. So if you're living in China, you'll learn a certain way of being in the world, or if you're living in England, you'll learn a different way about being in the world. But all of these different ways of learning have one thing in common, and that is you're learning beliefs about how to be in your particular world. So during the first stage, when the reptilian mind brain is dominant, what you're really trying to do as a fetus and as a baby is survive. You need your survival needs met, and these are warmth, food, water, and a clean bottom. Let me put it that way. So you need to be cared for. And if that happens, you develop a deep belief that you live in a safe world because you can survive. Your needs are met even before you know you have them. And then around the age of 2, the limbic mind brain becomes more dominant, and this is about being in relationship, close relationship with people around you. It's about love and belonging. And so the needs at this stage of development are slightly different. You need to feel loved and respected, and you need to feel there's a sense of belonging. And if those needs are met, then you grow up with some positive beliefs about relationships. And then the third stage, which is roughly from about the age of 8 or 9 through to the early 20s, is the differentiating stage. In this stage of development, you're learning how to be in the wider world. In the second stage, you were learning how to be in your family. But then you went to school and you began to spend more time with other people, with your peers. And so you want to be respected by your peers and by people in the outer world, and also by your parents. So the thing you're looking for at that differentiating stage is recognition. You want to be seen and recognized. It's so vitally important for teenagers to be seen and recognized by their parents and by their peers. So these are the first 3 stages of development. And as you can see, the values or the needs at each stage are different. And so whatever we value or whatever we need is what we value. So we learn a set of beliefs around these first 3 stages of development. And so if you were brought up in one country, I just use China, for example, the set of beliefs that you learn about how to fit in to your society will be different than the set of beliefs you learn if you grow up in the USA, for example. Because there's a worldview you live inside, and then there's a parental worldview you live inside, and these are different in different countries. And so by the time you get to your early 20s, you develop this whole set of beliefs and values about what's important to you. Thereafter, you can continue your development or you can get stuck. If you're relying on your parental environment and your cultural environment and your family environment to get your needs met, you probably won't ever advance very further. But more and more people are individuating. That's the 4th stage of development, where they begin to realize that they are not free because they're trapped by the beliefs that they learn during these first 3 stages of development. And then So the question that comes up in the mind is, well, what's important to me? I know what's important to my culture and to my family in order to get my needs met, but what's important to me? How do I find freedom in this context? Now, in a democratic society, that's relatively easy. In a non-democratic society, that can be quite difficult, because in a non-democratic society, they try to control you and they don't like people individuating. This was the case in many countries, like Russia, for example. Anybody who spoke out or had free thoughts which were different from the regime, they were put in prison. And so this individuating stage is fundamentally important to find out who you are at the deepest level of your being. You have to let go of your beliefs and think, well, what is valuable to me? What is it that I need? Because of whatever you need is what you value. And so at this time, sometimes when people individuate, they let go of their family background, they let go of their culture of origin, and to find out who they are. And this is the fourth stage of development, has a big shift in values, because you realize that, maybe you no longer fit in with your parents' beliefs or your national beliefs, and you want to honor who you are at the deepest level. Now, fundamentally, we're all souls having a human experience. And so at that level, at that fourth stage of development, we begin to tap into those universal needs or values which are present in all of us. And these are connecting values. So as we move from that fourth stage of development, which is fundamentally important, and incidentally, most of the world never gets to that stage of development because they're continually focusing on their survival, safety, and security needs, the first three stages of development. Well, then what happens is, as we move through that individuating stage, usually that's the 20s and 30s, and we get to late 30s and 40, and we begin to self-actualize, as Maslow put it. We begin to really become who we really are at the deepest level of our existence. And at the deepest level of our existence is our soul. Our soul incarnated into our bodies for specific reasons. And the three reasons are self-expression, connection, and contribution. These are the three desires of the soul. I don't call them needs in the way that ego has needs, but I call them desires, because if these desires are not met, you will find yourself getting sick. You will have ailments, you will have problems, and you will get depressed, for example, because you're not meeting your soul's desires. Now, there is nothing wrong with the needs of the first three stages of development, but the problem is they create fears. So if I don't feel like I have enough, or I don't feel loved enough, or I'm not enough, and there will be fears attached to that. And if you have these fears, they will stay with you and influence your relationships and your way of being in the world for the rest of your life. So it's important to understand what those needs are and why they arose in the first place, because you lived in a context that required you to focus on those needs. So letting go of the fears is really fundamental at the fourth stage of development and the fifth stage of development, because if you have those fears, the soul, the energy of the soul will not come through, because the fears will block your future growth and development. So really, personal mastery at this point is fundamentally important. Finding out what's holding you back. What are the fears that you're hanging on to that are stopping you from exploring the full depths of your soul? Anyhow, so now we move into the sixth stage of development, the fifth stage with self-actualization, where I begin to find, what is it that I'm here to do? What is my purpose in life? The questions we ask. Well, you may ask that question, but your soul already knows the answer to that question. It incarnated for certain reasons, and now you have to tap into those reasons. And then in the sixth stage of development, that fifth stage was self-expression, the next stage is connection. Because if you found your purpose and meaning at the fifth stage, in order to give those gifts that you have innately within you, you then need to express those gifts. And you can only do that by making a difference, and you can only make a difference if you connect with people. So it's no point in having any skills or wonderful attributes if you can't connect with people to make a difference. So after that sixth stage, which generally occurs in the 50s, Then we move to the last stage, which begins in the late 50s and early 60s, which is all about contribution, self-expression, connection, contribution. Now, contribution is about making, not more than making a difference, it's about giving your gifts to the world. So in a sense, at that stage, you've let go of all of your ego needs. And if you're living in soul consciousness, you'll find that actually all of your needs are met before you even know you have them. I mean, it's quite an advanced stage of being. I call that living from soul consciousness. So as you can see, the answer to the question, why is it important to look at your values at each stage of development or understand what they are? Because they will change. As you move through these seasons of your life, what's important to you will change. As a baby, what's important is survival. As a young child, what's important to you is love and belonging. What's important to you as a teenager is recognition and acknowledgement. What's important to you as a young person in their 20s and early 30s is freedom to explore who you are. What's important to you in your 40s is self-expression. What is it inside you that wants to be out in the world? And then in the fifth stage, what's important is making a difference. Well, we call it making a difference. It's actually your soul expression going out into the world and helping other people with their lives. And that's the level of empathy. And then in the last stage, serving stage, is about contribution. And this is when compassion really becomes important to you. So as you can see, each stage has different motivations. And when you're able to master all of the stages, you are living from full spectrum consciousness. So when we've answered the question, why is it important to look at different values at different stages? The question then is, well, why is that important in terms of the way that we show up in the world and what to do in that world? I know if you're a parent, this becomes really important because when you understand these stages, you can understand the needs of your child at each stage, and you can actually make sure your child is properly cared for. Now, unfortunately, this knowledge is not easily available, or it is in bits and pieces. But being a self-actualized parent, that's a parent who has actually reached that, been through the fourth stage of development and reached the fifth stage of development, you'll understand that you have an impact on your child, and that if you're not careful, you will create a child in your own image. But you don't want that. You want your child to be who they really are. Otherwise, they will not be unable to give their gifts to the world. And you want them to fully express. So teaching children right from the very start, from the age 2 or 3, how to fully express is important. Teaching children right from the start how to connect with other children is important. And teaching children how to contribute to the welfare of other children, other children in their classroom, is really important. So it really to live in a world, a peaceful world, a world full of joy and love, we need to re-educate, or we need to educate our children in this way. And as far as you're concerned, and myself, for example, I have to re-educate myself to understand these stages of development so that I can actually guide my child through these stages. Now, as a grandfather, I see this happening all the time. 2 grandchildren, 1 2 and 1 6. And so I'm watching these stages, and I'm trying to help these children fully self-express and not limit their self-expression, because somewhere they were going to click into their gifts and talents, and we want them to bring those gifts and talents into the world. So this is why this knowledge is fundamentally important, not just for parents, but for all teachers in the world, to understand these stages, and particularly the stages that children go through and what their needs are. And at the root of that is what I call a values-based education. So a values-based education is when we teach our children to become values literate at an early age, and not to work on beliefs, but to work on values, because values have the children turn inward and say, well, what is important and which values actually contribute to joy in my life. And what the children will find out is that connection, the value that link to connection, really bring them the things that they need. And so that's why all of this is important.
So the next question then comes out, whose responsibility is it to fulfill our needs? Well, ultimately, it's our own responsibility, but a child of 2 years old, a child of 6 years old, a teenager, 15 years old, is living in an environment where these needs have to be fulfilled by other people. It's only when we become independent of our parents and independent of our environment and the culture we were brought up in, that we can then take on that responsibility and that accountability for meeting our own needs. And that's what we do in the early 20s and 30s, is we take responsibility for satisfying our own needs. In the modern world, we leave home, we leave that safe environment, we create our own environment, we meet a partner, we have children. We now are creating an environment where we are not only just meeting our need, but we have to meet the needs of our children. Now, what I often say is that at my age, I have no needs, because all my needs are met by my soul's interactions with my environment before I even know I have those needs. That philosophy helps me to be at one with the world and understand that I am more than this ego, or this skin encapsulated ego, living in the world. And it also reminds me that I actually have a soul, having a human experience, and I don't have a soul, I am the soul. And so when I say I have no needs, because my soul always anticipates my needs, because I'm living the life of my soul. I don't have a soul, as I said, I am the soul. And so my soul knows what I need. The soul knows what it desires. So my needs and desires are met even before I know what they are. And it's pretty amazing, really. My soul, I've been working on this, I've been doing this work for 3 decades now, at least. And I realized that actually I've had 3 careers in my life. My first career, from the age of about 20 through to 45, was a transportation engineer. And that's what appealed to me. And that's what I became good at and was successful at. But then in my 40s, the time of self-expression, I realized that it didn't speak to me anymore, this work. And I was bored, actually. And I realized that what I needed to do is, instead of being a transportation engineer, become a transformation engineer. And so I started this research into the work that I'm sharing with you right now. And during this period, I learned that the fundamentally important thing is satisfying your soul's desires. And so I found ways to become one with my soul. And what I realized was, in order to become one with my soul, I had to take all separation out of my life. Because initially, when you were very young, in the first 2 years of your life, your soul created your ego because it couldn't stand the pain of separation. You see, the soul comes from this world of connection and love. And as it entered into this 3-dimensional material world, it began to realize over those first 2 years that there was actually separation in this world, and separation is very painful for the soul. So I realized later in life that if I wanted to live at one with my soul and at peace with myself, I needed to take separation out of my life. And so I realized that I had to become a member of all religions, because religion is a very separating thing. I'm this, and if I'm this, if I'm Catholic, or if I'm Protestant, or if I'm Muslim, I'm not that, and you are that, then I'm already created a degree of separation. So I decided to become a member of all religions in my mind, because at the origin, all religions are very similar. And secondly, nationality is a great separator. So after religion, we get nationality, and I decided to be a soul having a human experience. That also took care of the issue of race. Because if I say I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, I'm obviously not another race. So I wanted to take that degree of separation out, and we usually link that to our nationality. So now I could be at one with everyone. And then lastly, obviously I'm a male, or I'm a soul in a male body, and I had to embrace the female aspect of who I am. And the same for females, they have to embrace the male aspect of who they are. So by taking out these degrees of separation, I become one with the world. I become one with everyone. And that means that I can now connect with everyone. So when I see the man sweeping the street outside my house, I stop and I say hello, and I ask him how his work is going and thank him for keeping the streets clean. When I see the postman delivering mail, I greet him and say, well, I talk about the weather. I talk about how he is managing to deliver the mail in all weathers. And so what I'm doing is I'm giving that person recognition. I'm actually seeing that person. And that's the secret in life to having wonderful relationships, is to see other people and feel what they're feeling and to acknowledge them in their action. And so that's something we can also teach our children early on in life by example. So children learn by example. So what the most important thing is for you to become a role model, not just of values-based living, but a role model of soul consciousness. And then your children will grow up, individuate, and self-actualize quite smoothly. They will be able to let go of their fears, be able to find that freedom that they need to live their soul-inspired life. A fundamental aspect of this developmental path in these 7 stages is releasing fears. And people ask, well, how do I recognize my fears and what do I do about them? Well, it's not difficult to recognize the fears of the ego. If you've ever been angry, or you've ever been impatient, or you've ever been jealous, or you ever had one of these feelings of misalignment, well, behind it is a fear and an unmet need, an unmet ego need that you learned during childhood. So have you ever been angry? Well, of course, people say, of course I've been angry. I say, well, okay. So anger is really the result of a unmet need. So the question is, when you become angry, what can you do about it? You say, well, what need do I have which is not being satisfied right now? And that question allows you to get to the source of the fear that is in your ego mind. So every time you get irritated, angry, impatient, that's an unmet need and a fear coming from your childhood, that I won't get my needs met. And I'm not, and generally the fears are of 3 types. I don't have enough, I'm not loved enough, and I'm not enough. So let's say you're waiting in line for a queue of people for some sort of service at the counter, and there are other people in front of you, and you get impatient. Well, you see, that impatience is all about the unmet need of not being recognized, not being seen, and not being respected. And it comes from your childhood. So you have to let that go and then say, well, okay, so what's happening to this person who's at the front of the line, who is answering all these questions for all these people? Well, that person also has needs. And so you are projecting onto that person your impatience. When you get to the front of the counter, you will be angry. Well, there's no point in being angry. It's not that person's fault. That person is just doing their job. And so it's all about you, really. If you're angry, you're upset, you're irritated, it's really all about you not getting your needs met. And so you can say, well, what need do I have right now that is making me upset? This is very important in relationships. I mean, we all know relationships are difficult, particularly intimate relationships. And we often, well, maybe not so often, but we get irritated with our partner because of what's going on inside us. It's not their fault. It's what's going inside of you that's making you angry, upset. See, I can't make you angry. You make yourself angry through your belief about what's going on. So it's always all about you, who you are, and your emotions. It's all about you. So about you and your beliefs. When you understand that, you can see the world differently. You can see your relationships differently. And you're able to calm down and say, okay, well, actually, I am creating this anger. I am creating this emotional upset. Why? Because I'm not in alignment with my soul. I'm letting my ego's fears dominate my existence. So it's pretty easy to spot your ego's fears because you will feel out of alignment, you'll be upset, you'll feel angry, etc., etc., etc. So as soon as that happens, say to yourself, like I said to myself, Richard, I notice at the moment you are feeling angry. That's interesting. why are you doing that to yourself? What need do you think you have that is not being met at this particular moment? And then I stop and reflect, what need do I think I have at this particular moment? And then I remind myself, as a soul, actually, I have no needs. Oh, because my soul will always find a way of me getting my needs met before I even know I have that need. It also takes me out of my ego into my soul, because I know that if I've got fear in my life, it's blocking the influence of my soul. You see, my soul is connected to every other soul. And so what happens is that when you're operating out of soul consciousness and you're in alignment with your soul's motivations, things come into your life and they're exactly what you need in order to move forward. I mean, sometimes it happens when you're an adult that you lose your job or something happens which seems like a bit of a disaster. You're in a bad accident or something. And then a year or two later, you go, wow, actually, at the time, I thought that was terrible. And I felt like a victim. But actually, it turned out to be something really wonderful. It recentered me in my living out of ego consciousness into soul consciousness. And that's the whole journey, to live in peace with yourself, to live in peace with other people, to find joy in everything that you do. And if you're unable to do that, well, you will get depressed. And there's another sign. I talked about being angry. Depression is another sign that you're not living in alignment with your soul's motivations, because depression arises from the sadness of the soul at not being able to fulfill its desires. That's where depression comes from, because the soul incarnated into your body for certain reasons, to give certain gifts, and somehow the fears of the ego not allowing you to recognize or implement these gifts. And so the soul feels sad, and that sadness you feel as depression. So these are a couple of ways: sadness, anger, impatience. These are all signs that your ego's fears are actually controlling your life. So I often get asked the question, with this knowledge of deep knowledge of my ego soul dynamic, how can I change the world around me? Because what I see happening in the world makes me sad. There are wars, there are all sorts of horrible things happening in the world. And if I get too involved in that, the fears and the sadness are going to pull me down. How do I get past that? How do I surf past that? Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that everybody else in the world is going through the same stages of development. But unfortunately, not very many people, a small percentage, actually get through that individuating stage into the self-actualizing stage, where they begin to find joy in their life. So they're still trying to get their ego needs met. We see it particularly in the leaders of most governments. They're still operating at the first three levels of consciousness, which I'll talk about in the next video, but they're still operating to trying to get their childhood needs met. I could go through a whole list of world leaders and tell you what needs they're trying to get met in their adult life, which they never got met in their childhood lives. So I'm not going to name names, but you can look at each one of them and say, well, why is this person behaving in this way? Because they didn't get their childhood needs met. This understanding helps you to figure out what's going on. Now, what you can do about it, that's a different question. What you can do about it is to live in alignment with who you are. First of all, know yourself deeply. Live in alignment with your soul motivations. Now, not everybody has a soul motivation of being a crusader in the world, a liberator, or even a leader. The question is, what can I do in my environment? What can I do in my circle to alleviate suffering there? What can I do? And if you feel called, you might move out into the bigger world and try to alleviate that suffering elsewhere. It depends on what your skills are, and it depends on what your soul inclination is. But living in alignment with your soul is fundamentally important for finding peace and joy, no matter what else is going on in the world. However, you need to understand that whatever else is going on in the world is driven most of the sadness in that world and the suffering is driven by people influencing the situation, so other people can't get there, so they're not getting their ego needs met, and the people they rule are not getting their ego needs met. And so with that understanding, you bring you bring a sense of, oh, that's what's going on. I am not a victim, or we are not victim. We are suffering, maybe, but we can see why we're suffering, but I don't have to suffer because I can actually find my own peace in the center of me by living in alignment every day with my soul experience. So it's hard being a soul in this world where three-dimensional reality grabs us, and that three-dimensional reality is linked to our body and the fear that we have at the ego level for surviving. And so if you know you're going to survive anyhow, what does that mean? If you know you're a soul having a human experience and that death is just a simple separation, your consciousness will continue through death. And so now that gives a different perspective to survival. But again, we'll talk more about this in a following video. The 7 stages of psychological development model is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I took that model of Maslow and I extended it into self-actualization, and I changed the needs into values. I changed 1 or 2 things about the model, but one of the things that Maslow talked about was deficiency needs and how deficiency needs take precedence over our growth needs. That was one of his big things. Now, what he was basically saying is our fear-based beliefs take precedence over our growth needs, our love-based desires, if I can put it that way. So why do these deficiency needs, simply, I don't have enough, I'm not loved enough, and I'm not enough, take precedence over all our other needs? Well, because they're rooted in fear. And fear is a basic animal instinct. Every animal on the planet understands fear, and that's how it survives. And so we are also, in that sense, in three-dimensional material sense, animal. And so our history, if I can put it that way, is a history of trying to survive in this three-dimensional material world. And this has been true until very, very recent times, until the advent of democracy, if you like. I mean, 100, 200 years, we've seen democracy flourish. But up to that point in time, everybody lived in an environment where fear was rampant. You know, if you didn't obey, or if you didn't fit in, it was difficult to survive. And so it's rooted in our existence, these deficiency needs. And also what we learn during childhood, if we're brought up in America and brought up in China, we're brought in the UK, wherever we're brought up, we learn the specific needs that we have, which are not being met. And so those needs then become important to us later on in life, because we had to struggle so much to get those needs met. So this is why I say it's important to identify the fears of the ego, deal with them, which means personal mastery. It means overcoming those fears and recognizing you're not living the life of your childhood. You're now an adult, but these fears really are no longer apparent. Or let's put it this way: you need to loosen the grip of these fears on your life. And once you loosen the grip and understand why you're reacting in a particular way, you can begin to master those fears. Now, there are certain fears, the fears that we learn, particularly during the first 2 years of our lives, and even in the womb, and during the next few years, which are quite deeply embedded in our psyche. And these beliefs are difficult to unlock, and some people never unlock them. But understanding why, what they are and where they came from, and that particular point in your history when you develop these beliefs is important. Then you have the possibility of doing something about them. And if you don't do something about them, you'll be pretty much condemned to living a life in the first 3 levels of consciousness, which is pretty much the case of most of our leaders and political leaders there. And, you know, these leaders are popular because most of the populations in their countries are still operating from those 3 levels. So these leaders are popular because they're living out what has been or they have policies that reflect the needs of most of the population, which haven't self-actualized. I mean, I find it very interesting that in the USA, for example, half of the population of the USA voted for Donald Trump, who was clearly operating from those first 3 levels of consciousness, particularly the third level, which is I'm not enough. We're going to make America great again. Oh my God, that means he's not great. He doesn't feel great. That's what's important to him. And he's speaking to people who don't feel great because they never got those differentiating needs met. And so he's speaking their language, and so he's popular. And of course, the other half of the population voted for somebody different because they managed to master these needs. So we can't blame our politicians so much in a democratic society because we elect the people who speak to what we need in our lives. And what if we were to operate, if we were to elevate our consciousness, we were to move through this program of growth, we wouldn't be electing these people. We'd be electing more conscious leaders. And again, that's a topic we're going to deal with in another video. So there you have it. The governments that we elect are a reflection of the average level of consciousness of the people. And then there are many governments which are actually where we have authoritarian leaders. I mean, half the world lives in countries, or more than half the world live in countries which are not democratic. And so their leaders are people who have forced their way into positions of power to satisfy the need, I am not enough. We need to understand that. And how can we change it? Well, we have to re-educate ourselves and our children, not re-educate, but educate them into the stages of development and understanding how to get past these fear-based ego beliefs. So we're reaching the end of this video, and which makes me think about the question that people ask me, how did I come up with all of this? Where did it come from? And, I have friends who studied psychology and they never learned anything about ego-soul dynamics. Well, the reason they don't learn anything is because the soul went out of psychology nearly 100 years ago. Carl Jung was into the soul. Roberto Assagioli was into the soul. Even Maslow understood it. And the academic world took the soul out of psychology. And I took it upon myself to bring the soul back to psychology because it's at the root of everything. Some people say, well, I lead a spiritual life. No, I would say you lead a life where psychologically you connect with a larger universe, because it's all about psychology in the end. And spirituality is what we're talking about, is these higher levels of consciousness, which are explained by the 7 stages of development model. So where did it come from? Well, originally, as I mentioned earlier, I was inspired by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I realized it wasn't complete because it didn't look into the full realms of self-actualization. So I blended Maslow's hierarchy of needs with Vedic philosophy, where in Vedic philosophy, these higher levels of consciousness are understood. I blended these, I put them together to create the 7 levels model, the 7 levels of consciousness model, which we'll study in another video. But that led me then into the 7 stages of psychological development, because I began to realize that actually life was organized around different needs at different stages of development. And as we grow psychologically, then we have these different needs and we have these different desires. Now, another question I'm often asked is, how can you accelerate your personal growth? Well, you can to a certain extent, but these stages are actually linked to the seasons of our lives, and you can move through these seasons with ease or with difficulty. And so the more advanced you are in consciousness, the more easy it is to move through these stages of development. Now, many young people say to me, well, I'm 22 and all I want to do is make a difference. And that's level 6. I must be at that higher level of consciousness. Well, you have to ask yourself the question, where is the idea of making a difference come from? Because if it's coming from achievement, I want to make a difference, and you set up goals and it's all about you making a difference in the world, that's really still the ego stuff going on. The 6th stage of development, which is about making a difference, is all about empathy. And so you're actually feeling what the people are feeling or what the earth is feeling. And that's why you act in that way. And at the 7th level, it's about a sense of compassion. So empathy is about feeling and understanding and listening, whereas the 7th level is about doing something about it. That's where compassion is empathy in action. And so we have to understand that just making a difference isn't enough. We have to go beyond that and into action. And we have to understand the motivations that we have for making that difference and making these compassion actions in our life. We have to understand what are our motivations in doing that. And usually in the 20s and 30s, not always, but usually it's about the sense of making a mark in the world, being seen, achievement. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't mistake that for living at the 6th level of consciousness. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of this first video, and I hope you found it useful. In a forthcoming video, we're going to talk about the 7 levels of consciousness and how they are different from the 7 stages of development. Briefly, we all go through the 7 stages of development. At any moment in time, we can be, depending on the circumstances in our life, we can be at any level of consciousness. So I can be at the 4th stage of development. I'm a 25-year-old exploring the world, and suddenly I find myself in a situation where which is extremely fearful. I will descend down to the 1st level, survival level of consciousness. So the stages of development follow the seasons of our lives. At any moment in time, we can be at any level. We could even be having a meditative level 7 experience, even though we're only at the 4th stage of development. Okay, thank you.